Kairon has walked through the largest libraries that have pondered the greatest works that have debated with the sharpest minds of the time. He believed that he had reached the threshold of absolute knowledge where there were no more questions he could not answer. But there was one thing that he never admitted to himself. Even though he possessed all that knowledge, he still felt empty. Not because he lacked knowledge, but because he didn't know what he was looking for. There is no seal, no sender, only a single inscription. You have reached the end of knowledge, but do you really understand it? He frowned, looking at the paper as if it contained some kind of code. Was this an intellectual challenge? A puzzle that someone wants him to solve? He flipped it over and over, but it was nothing but that it wasn't an arbitrary question. It attacked the very weak point he was still trying to deny. 2 days later, while he was still busy thinking about the meaning of the mysterious message, a stranger appeared at his door. He didn't give his name, just gave him a smaller piece of paper with only 2 words written on it. He knew that name. The heart is not a place but a myth. It is said that it is a province of wisdom where the greatest minds gather to pursue absolute perfection of thought. But it is only a legend, a story circulated among scholars as an ideal that never really exists. There is no place where people are allowed to live outside the laws of society just to pursue pure knowledge. The stranger looked at him with calm eyes, as if he knew his reaction in advance. If you really want to know if the heart connection exists, follow me. The instinct of a truth seeker told him that this was a moment not to be missed, but another part of him was coldly reasoning, wondering. This was a joke, a trap, an experiment by some secret group. He didn't believe in a nonsensical arrangement, but he believes in meaningful coincidence, that there are things that appear that are not immediately understood. Let me choose. And he chose him after the stranger. They in the city when the sun went down the streets that Kairon. Having never set foot in the bright boulevards, they gradually entered the dark alleys, hidden corners of the world which he didn't expect to exist, and then they left the city and entered the land where the map was not marked all the way without the guide saying a word. But he didn't need an answer either. The only thing that mattered was that he was going to where he needed to be. And that night he didn't know how far he had walked. Only that when the first light of dawn came they were standing in front of a gate, which was not made of wood, not of stone. It doesn't seem like the gate is just an empty space between 2 cliffs, but when you look through it, he felt as if he was looking at a different reality. The guide stopped and turned towards him. This was the point that people like you had to decide. If you walk by, you can't turn back the way you came. Kairon is silent. He doesn't need to hear more. If this was a game, he had accepted the rules from the first moment he stepped through, and the world behind the gate swallowed him up. He felt as if he was falling, without gravity, without direction, without any signs that he was still present in physical space. But he didn't panic. His mind worked like a perfect machine even in the most unusual situations. He didn't believe in magic, much less in a game that could break the laws of physics. He only believed in logic. If there was something he didn't understand, it wasn't because it couldn't be understood, but simply because he didn't have enough data to explain it. The feeling of falling disappeared suddenly, as if space had just decided that he had reached where he needed to go. He landed on a rocky floor without any impact. There was no tremor, it was merely a change of state. He stood in the middle of a large room, 4 walls rising endlessly. There was no clear light source, but everything was perfectly visible in front of him. There were 5 people in front of him. They sit on stone benches like that, have been there for thousands of years. No one has introduced them. No one has expressed their emotions. They were simply the entities that existed in the space, watching him with a gaze that was hard to detect. Among them, the oldest seemed to slowly raise his voice. You have walked through the door, which means you are ready. But before you go any further, you must understand one thing. Illusion is not something that can be learned. It can only be left behind. He frowned. A paradoxical but not something he had never heard from ancient philosophers who said, the supreme wisdom is not the accumulation of knowledge but the discarding of what is unnecessary. But if it is true, then why does the heart exist? If it's all about giving up, then why is there a game to conquer? The second spoke up. You think you're here to find answers, but what you really find will be a question you have never dared to face. The third, you believe that knowledge is light, but you have never wondered, can light become darkness? The fourth said, you have come to the end of thought, but have you ever thought that it is thought that is the final barrier? The fifth man was silent. He waited for a question, a remark, a challenge. But he said nothing. Just look at him like that, look through him like that. He has seen everything he has ever known, every belief, every fear. He waited for a guide, a specific instruction on what to do next, but there was nothing. No rules, no challenge without any indication that this is a game in any conventional sense. He broke the silence. So what should I do? The oldest slowly shook his head. We don't give answers, because we don't hold the answers. You must find it yourself. But before you can begin, answer a question. Do you really know who you are? He left an almost innocent elementary question, but he knew that if it was asked here, it couldn't be as simple as it seemed. I'm Kairon. I am a person who has been through all of these things, the greatest knowledge system of mankind. I have read, studied, and thought to the bottom of all concepts. The third person smiled slightly. So if I take all those things, what do you have left? He was about to answer immediately, but that question suddenly stopped his flow of thought. If there was no knowledge, no thinking, no what he had learned, what was he? A living body? An empty consciousness? An existence without definition? The silence lasted for a long time, and the fifth person who had never said a word spoke at this time, and his voice was light but echoing, as if emanating from the surrounding space itself. You don't know who you are. And because of that, you're not ready to play. Everything around him disappeared. He fell again. But this time he was no longer sure whether he was falling or falling on himself. Kairon falls into an endless void, but this time there is no sense of panic, no fear of disorientation. He didn't know where this was, but it didn't matter anymore. What he had just heard, seen, and experienced made him realize one thing. He never really understood himself if his knowledge was taken away. What he was if the concepts of the world, what he believed was just a shell. Where was his true nature? He didn't have time to think longer. The surrounding space gradually shaped the images that appeared in front of his eyes, reflecting something familiar. Strangely distorted in front of him was a mirror that was not a single mirror but hundreds and thousands of fragments. Each piece reflects a different version of himself, an ambitious young Kairon whose eyes light up with the belief that knowledge is the key to it all. A weary old Kairon sits among hundreds of books, but his eyes are blank. It was as if he knew everything, but there was nothing left to look for. A Kairon with an arrogant gaze standing on the podium looked down at those who were listening to him as if he were the truth. A thin Kairon with a distorted gaze, wondering. In the midst of the ruins of a civilization he once believed he could fully understand, they all looked at him. No one said anything, but he felt something deeper than words, an invisible question, a pressure, as if those beings were waiting for him to do something. He tried to walk but realized that there was no way out. There were only mirrors, versions of himself stretched to infinity. A voice rang out, not from any of the mirrors, but from his own mind. Who are you looking for? He doesn't answer, but the voice doesn't stop. You're trying to run away from something. He gritted his teeth. This was not reality. This was just another challenge of the game. He didn't let himself get caught up in nonsense. But then one of his beings in the mirror spoke up. Kairon, are you sure you are not afraid? He turned back to that being. It was not a strange version, that he was just as he was now. You believe that you can find the truth, but you have never dared to ask, what if the truth does not exist? He felt something cold running down your spine, believing that you are a fool, but if all you know is an illusion, why does he want to deny it? But you can. You think you can control your perception. But what if that perception itself is a prison? He clenched his hands, feeling like everything was collapsing, as if his own human foundation was being pulled out of reality. The mirrors began to crack, his other selves disappeared one by one, leaving only him and the person on the other side. The only entity that looked directly at him with eyes without the slightest doubt. He knew what was coming if this was really a game. Then he had only one way to move on. He moved forward without hesitation and punched his own image in the mirror. The sound of shattering sounded like a silent explosion. Shards of glass fell, but instead of touching the ground, they disappeared into nothingness, leaving nothing but darkness. And then a door opened, not a physical one, but a void that leads to something that cannot be expressed in words. Another reality, a deeper layer of the game. He knew he had to walk in, and this time he was no longer sure that he was still Kairon as he had before. Kairon walked through the door, or perhaps it was the door that swept him into a new reality. The space around him changed instantly. No more darkness, no more mirrors that reflected other versions of himself. Now he stood in the middle of a huge hall, where the walls are carved with thousands of symbolic formula characters of the civilizations he has studied. In front of him was a long stone table, and on the table was a puzzle without an instructor. No mysterious voice appeared this time. There was only a puzzle waiting for him to decipher. Fill in the blanks. What exists that cannot be grasped? What is understood but cannot be expressed? What is present everywhere but cannot be seen? Kairon reads through once. A simple question is, it can't be that simple. This is the game for the greatest minds. Couldn't it give an easy challenge that he glanced at each possibility in the beginning of time? No, time is measurable. Consciousness? No, consciousness can be experienced. Nothing? No, nothingness cannot exist. He thought deeper, faster. This question was not just an intellectual test but a test of how he thought. If he approached it with pure logic, he would fall into the same endless loop. But if he used his intuition, he would risk getting lost in the ambiguity. A thought flashed through his head. What would happen if he couldn't answer? At that moment, he felt the surrounding atmosphere change. The space seemed to close, as if this puzzle didn't just exist in his mind. Not only did he control the reality here, but a voice sounded from no direction, but seemed to echo from the rock platform below him. Don't you realize? It's your thoughts that are holding you captive. Kairon frowned. He didn't like mere philosophical paradoxes. Knowledge must be systematic. There must be logic. But is that really true? He suddenly remembered the things that the teachers in the darkness said. You believe that knowledge is light, but you have never wondered, can light become darkness? And then he realized he was stuck. But not because the puzzle was too difficult, but because he himself had made the search for the answer. The most important thing is that he has lived his whole life in search of the truth, but he has never wondered what happens if the truth cannot be found. His hand touched the stone in front of his fingers, drawing a single word in the gap of the puzzle. No, nothing can grasp. Nothing can be expressed. Nothing can be seen. The moment the word "not" was carved down, the entire room shook. The characters on the wall began to fade as if the entire knowledge base he had once believed in was dissipating. But he wasn't afraid. He stood quietly watching everything collapse around him. He had found the answer, but what was more frightening was that he was no longer sure that he really wanted to know it. A new door opened before his eyes. No more stones, no more walls. Just a void that led to something. He had never imagined that this time. He walked in without hesitation. Kairon walked through the door and realized that there was nothing left to step up. No ground, no sky, no fulcrum. But he still exists, still moves like that. Reality. Now it was just an invisible flow around him. An erased white void with no line and no darkness. No sound nor silence. An absolutely empty space. But empty does not mean meaningless. In front of him, a huge stone tablet appeared. Like that, it had always been there, waiting for him to arrive. On the surface the lines of words began to appear slowly. It was as if someone was writing right in front of him, but when he tried to read the words, they disappeared as soon as his eyes touched them. In them he blinked, trying to concentrate. None of the words lasted long enough for him to grasp. He tried to recall what he had just seen, but his memory was as blank as if all ideas of words were being erased from his mind the moment they appeared. A voice sounded out of nowhere as if it was coming from the very flow of space around him. You have reached the end of knowledge. But have you ever wondered if there are no words that knowledge still exists? He stiffened. This question hit his core. He had always believed that knowledge could be transmitted, that every concept can be interpreted if the right words are used. But if the words themselves are a barrier, if the true nature of knowledge cannot be described, but can only be experienced, he reaches out and touches the cold stone slab. It felt real, but when he tried to draw a word, the handwriting disappeared as soon as it was written down. Another voice spoke softer, but echoed, believing that you could reach the truth by understanding it. But if the truth could not be understood but could only be lived, why did he take a step back? A terrifying idea had just appeared in his mind. If everything he has ever learned, known, and believed is just an artificial structure, if every knowledge system defines, every model that humans create is just drawings on the surface of the water, and the moment we touch them, they disappear. He looked back at the stone tablet. There were no more words. There were no signs that anything had ever been written on it. There were no questions, No answers, only absolute silence. He felt something inside him stretch. It was as if his entire thinking system was being disassembled piece by piece, layer by layer, painless, fearless. But there is a quiet collapse, as if a great structure has just reached its own limit, and then for the first time in life, he had no words to speak, no ideas to hold, nothing more to define himself. At that moment, the door finally opened. There was no light, there was no blinding, there was no music, heaven, there was no glory of the victor. There was only one footstep, and he walked through Kairon through the door, but this time there was no world waiting for him on the other side. Space is no longer a concept that can be described because it has no color, no shape, no point of reference. He no longer has a sense of gravity in the direction of his own existence as a separate entity. There was nothing, and in that emptiness he realized something terrifying. He no longer knew who he was, what his name was, where he came from. What was his purpose? Everything he once thought he knew about himself had been swept away like the words that had disappeared on the stone slab before. Not because someone took it away, but because it never really had everything he ever defined about himself. Knowledge, memory, identity, ambition are just the structures that his mind erects to maintain the illusion of an ego. And now that there was nothing left to cling to, he stood in front of the most naked reality that no Kairon had ever really existed. The moment that thought touched him, his entire perception shattered, not in the way that a body was torn apart, not in the way that a spirit is crushed, but in the way that an illusion dissolves when the light comes in. There was no screaming, no panic, no one to fear, nothing to hold back, and it was at that point that he saw it all. Not with the eyes, not with thoughts, but with something that cannot be expressed in words. There are no observers and objects to be observed. No more subject and object. No more questions and answers, only pure presence, not bound by any framework. He realized that the illusion Tao had never existed. There had never been any challenges. There has never been a gate without masters. There have never been puzzles that are all just a structure created for him to go through so that he can unravel on his own what he once believed to be real. And now, when there was nothing left to cling to, nothing to seek, he was faced with the last choice, a choice that could not be expressed in words, because any expression is another layer of illusion that he can leave or he can go back. But where he left and who he returned to. When there is nothing left to define himself, is there really someone to leave or come back to? He doesn't need to answer that question because he already knows. And at that moment, the world reappears, without glorious light, without miraculous rebirth. There is no sign that he has succeeded or become enlightened. Simply that everything is back to what it is. He was standing in the middle of a familiar road. The sky was still blue, the wind was still blowing, the world was still moving in a way which it has always been like. But there is one thing that has changed. There are no more questions, no one left to look for answers. There was only absolute silence within, a stillness he had never experienced before, and he walked away. No destination, no purpose, nothing to prove or achieve. Simply walked Kairon through the old paths, glanced at familiar faces, heard the conversations he had participated in, witnessed the people who were still intoxicated with what they believed to be the most important thing in their lives. He did not feel more than losing, did not feel the need to affirm that I went further than them, because he knew no one was going further than anyone else. It was all just repetitive trajectories, endless spins in a game that can only be put down when one is bored with oneself. He saw a man as preaching about a great ideology that believes that its principles will liberate people from suffering. He sees another person who is skeptical of all theories but does not realize that rejection is also a kind of attachment. He saw a person praying to put his faith in a supernatural force he had never seen but believed could lead the way. And he also saw people like him of old, who did not believe in gods, who did not believe in permissive philosophies. He believed in his own intellect, believing that knowledge could break all illusions, but he knew they were all still at play. The game doesn't care what the player believes because its essence is to make the player believe that there is something worth pursuing. Whether it's knowledge or religious power or skepticism are all different shapes of the same trap. They just ran and searched and clung to what they believed to be real without ever wondering if all this was really necessary. He wanted to tell them that this game never existed, that every theory and truth they pursued, in the end, it was just circles repeating illusions that were erected to sustain itself. But he didn't say, because he knew no one could hear what they weren't ready to understand. He just stood there quietly observing. Some people who saw him noticed an unusual silence in his eyes. Some tried to ask questions, tried to draw him into a dialogue. An argument tried to convince him of something they believed to be true. But he just smiled, shook his head, and walked away. He had nothing to teach them because the truth could not be taught. Anything that could be said, anything that could be written into a book, anything that can be systematized into thought is not the ultimate truth. All philosophy, no matter how sublime, is just a boat to cross the river. But if the passerby keeps hugging the boat even after reaching the other bank, they never really got anywhere, and he knew that as long as they wanted to play they would keep playing. There are those who will play all their lives. There are those who are like him in the past who will believe that they are close to the end, but in fact, they are just entering another labyrinth, more sophisticated, deeper but still a labyrinth. And there are also those who will one day suddenly stop, not because they find the answer, but because they realize that no question needs to be asked in the first place. Kairon continued to walk aimlessly, without a destination. But this time he was no longer bound by anything. There is no one to lead, nor does anyone really need to be guided. There are people who walk because they believe that there is something waiting ahead. There are people who stop because they believe they understand it all. But those who believe in pursuit are just as lost as those who believe in stopping. In this work, the name Kairon that the philosophical heart calls may not carry any meaning or may contain all. It can be a marker of a transformation or just a shadow, and if even that name disappears, what is left of the illusion Tao, as philosopher Tam calls it in this story, is not a place nor a system of knowledge. It is the state of mind where a person falls into when they believe that something needs to be sought, an answer needs to be grasped. But the more we try to grasp it, the more it dissipates and the more we let go of the search. It also never existed in the first place. The heart is neither a nut to be dismantled nor a mystery to decipher. It only exists when we believe that we are bound. But who created it if not ourselves? Maybe we're still looking for something. Maybe we've believed we've found it. Or maybe we've realized that there's nothing to find. There is nothing to understand, nothing to escape. So if it is all just a spiral of one's own making, if there has never been any attachment in the first place, is there really a need for liberation? So if you have to say one last thing, perhaps wish is you. No need for a wish.